So let me start by a summary of yesterday's tutorial. So we saw that in the orbit closure of the determinant, the main problem is that there are points which have the circuit size blows up exponentially. And because of that, the NNL for the orbit closure is currently in X space, especially because of this phenomenon. And even bringing it to, for example, X is a major challenge. And what it says is that if the stronger form of the permanent versus determinant conjecture is true, then it can actually be brought down all the way essentially from X space to date. Now that is completely unimaginable at this point. I mean, the gap is huge. So how can this even happen? So the one thing was, if the gap cannot be closed, what would be the negative conclusion? And then we saw that if NNL, for example, cannot be brought down to sub X, then under reasonable assumption, VP would be equal to VNP and NP would be contained in P/poly and so forth. So there would be a foundational failure in complexity theory if this exponential blow up in the circuit size. So for example, if you cannot find hitting set against this exponential circuit size in sub-exponential time, and all the complexity theory at present seems to suggest that way, then there would be a foundational collapse. Now I didn't state my own personal view. I mean, it just seems that this is all beyond imagination from the current complexity theory point of view, but that doesn't mean that it is not feasible in principles. I mean, in principle this may be possible, and I didn't state my personal view. And actually the positive view of GCT is that this chasm is not an evidence against these conjectures, but rather a measure of their difficulty. I mean, it may still be possible to come down from X space to date, but it's just that, I mean, there is no scientific evidence at this point for this belief. But I also share that belief, okay? So actually the positive view is that but to do this, implement this positive view, which is what the GCT program is all about, what would need to be done. So of course we all want that all these things should be different, NP should be not contained in P/poly, P equal to BPP. But to implement that this positive view of GCT, what would need to be done is to show that under reasonable assumptions, GRH and so forth, and including the robustness thesis, any proof, what this says is that any proof of the V0 equal to NP conjecture would need to produce a heating set, which is a set of matrices against polynomials of exponential size in the orbit closure in sub-exponential time. Now current complexity theory says that the circuit size matters. In any de-randomization procedure, you can't beat the circuit size. And this basically says that if all these conjectures are to be true, then under reasonable assumption, you would have to do what current complexity theory suggests you may not be able to do. And the reason you may be able to do it here, because though there is exponential blow up in the circuit size, all these families, there is a structure there, because they are contained in the orbit closure of the determinant. So that fact somehow would have to be used to beat this circuit size bound and bring it down to date.
Can you review what you mean by a hitting set?
Is the set of those matrices that I said, which actually reduces the orbit closure to the smaller dimension, so which gives that normalizing map. Normalizing map. For mathematicians, normalizing map. For complexity theory is hitting set, okay? The matrices that I was talking about yesterday. So anyway, this is what the program is all about, how to do this. It seems well beyond, at least it should be clear that this conjecture seems well beyond the reach of the existing techniques, and which is why the program is needed, and which is what this program is all about. And given the magnitude of the gap, some deep synthesis of geometry and complexity seems needed, and that is what GCT in a broad sense is about. So today I'm not going to talk about, so let us accept that at present we don't have technology to how to construct heating set against these exponential blow circuits of exponential size, even using this structure in sub-exponential time. So today I'm going to ask only intermediate questions. To begin with, let us ask, can we de-randomize Noether's normalization lemma for some intermediate explicit varieties in which these border issues don't arise? Because let's accept that we don't have technology to deal with the border. So can we do that? Okay, so, and the answer is yes, up to a quasi-prefix. And so these are some positive answers today, and which is what this talk would focus on. And more basic question is, actually this Noether's normalization lemma was proved by Hilbert in the context of the so-called equivalence problem of invariant theory, which is a fundamental problem of Klein's Erlangen program. Can this foundational problem be solved explicitly?
So,
now,
I just want to make sure I know. So when you say de-randomized Noether's normalization lemma for some intermediate explicit variety. That means you have an explicit variety and you're looking for a linear space of near complementary dimension, that explicit space that misses it.
Yeah, but that space has to be described by that hitting set. I mean, so I will explicitly describe today, okay, for these things, because that is not just equations. Because if you try the variety is contained in exponential size ambient space, okay. So you try to specify those equations, that will take exponential time. So you have to come up with.
You could take points on a linear space and say the span of the.
But the dimension is exponential. So you take any point, your specification will take exponential time. Everything has to be done in polynomial time.
Okay.
So I will explain that today in concrete examples. That is the whole point, okay? So I will explain that because this is something explicitly that was never formalized in mathematics, nor was it explored. And I think this can be done in some fundamental cases, which Hilbert was talking about, is actually the main contribution of the GCT program and this paper. That actually this can be done in some fundamental special cases, including the focus of Hilbert's paper. The Hilbert's paper was actually the invariant theory of, for example, ternary forms, where actually the number of generators where itself all the problems arise, and there actually you can do it very efficiently. So, but before we come to, so first we'll start with this equivalence problem, which was the focus of Hilbert's paper, and then the more difficult problem of explicitly de-randomizing Noether's normalization lemma. So that should explain everything, because this explicit is the main thing. Okay, so first the equivalence problem. Let V be an n-dimensional representation of G equal to SLMC. Let V1 to Vn be the coordinate functions of V. Call a polynomial Fv in the coordinate ring of V invariant if F sigma inverse V equal to Fv for all sigma belonging to G. Okay, and let CVG denote the subring of invariants. Now let us call 2 points V and W equivalent if for every invariant F belonging to CV, F of V is equal to F of W. And this is so for the specialist in algebraic geometry, they would see right away if and only if the orbit closures of V and W intersect, okay, and do not intersect.
So F is any function or invariant?
Invariant, every invariant I said.
Yeah, you didn't write CVG.
Yeah, every invariant, okay. So, and the problem equivalence is given V and G. So V is given just G, or you just specify G by the representation matrices for the generators. Okay, given V and G and two rational points V and W, decide if they are equivalent. Okay, and this is a basic problem in Klein's Erlangen program, because there the whole thing is the equivalence is the main thing. I mean, can you distinguish between 2 points on the basis of their invariant properties? Okay, so that is and this is a foundational problem of mathematics, and this is actually was the focus of Hilbert's program, Hilbert's paper, and this is how the paper started. So this is the history of equivalence. So Hilbert in 1890 showed that this invariant ring is finitely generated, and the proof was non-constructive. Now this implies that equivalence has a finite non-uniform circuit in the terminology of complexity theory, because of finite size, because once you have it means that there are finitely many number of generators, and to distinguish between 2 points you have to just evaluate those finitely many number of generators. So in principle there is a finite non-uniform circuit. That itself was a huge deal, just to show that a finite non-uniform circuit exists. And this is what Gordon called mythology. And then came the famous paper of Hilbert, in which he gave an algorithm for constructing a finite set of generators for this. And this implies that equivalence is decidable. Okay? And it has to be noted here that this was not known before Hilbert, even for m equal to 3. For m equal to 2, this was given by Gordon, such a decidable procedure. For m equal to 3, that is number of 3 variables, okay, when the dimension of the group is 3, this was not known. In fact, Hilbert's paper focused on just this, because all the ideas are just illustrated by just for m equal to 3. Then, but Hilbert, though he showed that it was decidable, he couldn't give any upper bound. Everything was just going out of control. Okay. Then Popov, a century later, Popov gave an explicit upper bound on the running time of Hilbert's algorithm. 2 decades later, Dirksen showed that equivalence is in p-space. He didn't actually worry about the complexity bounds, but he showed that those degree bounds can be brought down to polynomial when m is constant, and that, though he didn't say it using standard complexity theory, it would follow that it is p-space, but he had solved the heart of the problem to show that the problem is in p-space. Now you would think that that is all that is how far you can go, that there is some inherent blow up in the problem, because as we saw in Popa's earlier lecture, it seems that this blow up is inherent, that you can't do much about it. And the reason is that even when m is constant, the number of generators would be exponential in n. So it seems that this is how far you can go, and beyond this, just because the number of generators are going to be exponential in n, even for constant m, this is probably as far as you can go. Huh? N is the dimension of V. Huh? N is the dimension of V, and G is the dimension of G. M is the dimension of G. Okay. So even when m is constant, the number of generators is exponential in n. Okay, and there is not much you can do about it. Probably that is inherent. Okay, even when m is constant. So because of that, it may appear that that's it. Maybe the problem is p-space complete or whatever. You can't go beyond it because, yeah.
Does it known for finite groups solution? G is finite.
Finite group what?
If G is finite, what is Varanian time?
No, there also it is exponential. It can be very bad. Okay, so it seems that exponential is inherent because the number of generators can be exponential even for finite groups. Okay, even when for finite group, I don't know what happens with constant m, but for when GLM constant, the number of generators can be exponential. So maybe the problem is p-space complete, and this is how far you can go. And the main result of equivalency is, and this is a shock actually, that equivalence is in det inside P when m is constant. That is, not only it has a polynomial time algorithm, but actually you can actually solve it, reduce it to just computation of one determinant of size polynomial in n. So that is, given your V and G and the representation of V and the representation matrices, you can construct in log space a matrix of size n to the sum. Of course, m is constant, n to the some constant which depends on m, and then just take the determinant of it. If that determinant is non-zero, the orbit closures do not intersect. If the determinant is 0, the orbit closures intersect. So that actually is a very...
I'm confused. Can you just write down m and n are what? Because
They sound the same.
V, G is acting on this, equal to GLMC.
Okay.
Dimension of V is n.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah?
So we fix the group and we're varying the representation.
Yes.
And then it's quickly computable.
Quickly compute. So the point is that even when m is constant, like in ternary forms and all that, this dimension, the number of generators is exponential. So that can be beaten. So that is the whole point, and you can actually do it in det, which is the class of problem that can be reduced to computation of the determinant. And this is the class of problems which can be solved fast in parallel, and this is the class of problems which can be solved in polynomial time. So this is then the history for when m is constant. So first you have Hilbert's algorithm and for finite non-uniform algorithm. So mythology as per Gordon, then decidable without an explicit upper bound, a century later an explicit upper bound, then you can get, shows that it is in p-space, and this also follows from Grobner basis theory, and then now it turns out that it is in det. So you can see that there is quite a remarkable drop in the status of this problem from a problem that was not even known to be decidable before Hilbert to a problem that is now in det. Now, of course, Hilbert and others did not think about all these complexity issues, and I think that bringing this complexity theoretic perspective to this classical invariant theory, we believe is the main contribution of the GCT program and this specific paper, that when you actually think of this from the complexity theoretic perspective, what seems to be an inherent blow up in the problem size in the classical invariant theory actually can be brought under control.
But in some ways, they did think about reducing it to linear algebra.
No, they did, because all these things actually finally reduces to solving some systems of linear equations. It's just that the size of that linear systems of equations, that is actually what they were trying to do. Even Hilbert finally want to do something, reduce it to some linear algebra things, but it's just that the sizes of the matrices were going out of control.
Because I understand that one of Hilbert's students did this, right? Grete Hermann. Right?
She was a student of Amy Noether.
Oh, of Amy Noether, I didn't know.
Did what?
Grete Hermann was a student of Amy Noether.
And he gave the explicit the bounds.
Yeah, they were
Double exponential. So the point is that all those bounds of the matrices which occur in the algorithm were just going out of control. Okay, so they did worry about actually getting the matrices, the sizes of the matrices under control. In fact, Hilbert student, other students did that. But it's just that it seemed that there is something inherent difficulty in the problem that these matrix sizes would just go out of control. And
but the point I try to make is they were aware of the difference between recursive and primitive recursive, because I think this construction was to somehow capture primitive recursiveness.
so I don't know exactly what they were aware of, but I think they were worried about the size. They didn't have the notion, but they knew what a large matrix means. I think they knew that the matrix that I knew. So other than that, what they know, but the point is, it seems actually when you go through Hilbert's algorithm, that it seems that these sizes of the matrices are going to go out of control because of the inherent nature of the problem. It seems like that. And what this says that that's not so. You can bring it under control. So let me give high-level picture of the proof, because this is what invariant theorists would want to know. So what happened in between? That, of course, what happened in between was complexity theory was born, and I think so. It is really the coming together of algebraic geometry and complexity theory here.
Is this theorem equivalent to the previous theorem, the last talk of Popov, deciding whether orbit closures?
No, this is easier than that. So that is saying one orbit is in the intersection of other, right? And this is the two orbit closures intersect. This is easier because whether one orbit is in the closure of other can't be distinguished on the basis of invariants. Okay, so that would be more difficult. But under for the things that matters, the conjecture would be that even that can be done in polynomial time. I won't talk about that today. Yeah.
When m is constant, our matrices have constantly m square many unknowns. So can one write down a system of polynomials in m square unknowns to solve this?
No. Because the point is that the number of generators become exponential in n, even when m is constant, showing any bound on that is difficult. That is what Hilbert's thing was, that there is some finite algorithm for even writing down such generators. Even that is a very difficult thing. That was Hilbert's contribution, even for constant time. Okay. So,
Does it imply some, like, that you can reconstruct a circuit of small size, that if you have some polynomial which computes, and you can find if it has circuit of small size or not? Does this result imply something like this?
excuse me?
So, this result, it looks like it should imply something like, that if you have a polynomial which has small circuit, you should be able to find this circuit. Does it imply something like this, or does it imply for some complexity measures?
Okay, maybe I can come to that later. Yeah, I didn't get yours. Okay, so let me try to give how complexity theory and invariant theory come together. So let V be so high level picture of the proof. So what plays an important role in this proof? So let V be an n-dimensional representation of G equal to JLMC, R be the ring of invariants, let V1 to Vn be the coordinate functions, and let F1 to FL be a finite set of generators of R, which exists by Hilbert, okay? We say that an explicit FFT, first fundamental theorem, holds for R if there exists a poly-NM time computable circuit C with rational constants over the variables v and an auxiliary set x, x1 to xl, where L is polynomial in n of variables, such that the polynomial cvx computed by this circuit can be expressed as cvx, and then you expand it, okay, as polynomial in x alpha, then this would be polynomials in v. So then this f alpha v's generate the ring R. Okay, so what?
So L is different in the two paragraphs, or is it related? There's an index L that's in both paragraphs.
Which paragraph? Yeah, no, that is different. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. This actually has to be polynomial, and that can be exponential. So good point. Yeah. So the whole point is, even though there can be x, so the whole point is actually that the number of generators would generally be exponential, even when m is constant. But still, you can actually write down this circuit of small size, and you can compute that circuit given v and g in polynomial time, such that the polynomial computed by that circuit, if you were to expand it, of course you can't actually expand it, but if you were to write it down as expand it out, the coefficients would generate the ring R. Okay, so
x of alpha, that's a monomial in the x.
Yeah. And this is a polynomial in V. Okay, so in that sense, though there are exponentially many generators, they can actually come. This generating function can actually be captured by a small circuit. Okay, that actually is the main complexity theory idea which comes here. Okay, so this is the main. So this is the. Of course, the first fundamental theorem have been investigated in invariant theory since while. I will come to that. But this notion of explicitness really comes from complexity theory, and that is what really the key idea. So, for example, let us take take the ring of invariant. This is the main result of while in this setting. So let V be Cm to the R copies of Cm with left action of G equal to SLMC, and let Z be a variable M by R matrix whose entries are the coordinates of V. Okay. Then the first fundamental theorem of while says that the ring CVG is generated by the principal M by M minors of Z. Now, let us see that, of course, while knew that there is something good about this result, okay, which is why it is called the first fundamental theorem of invariant theory, and all mathematicians knew that there is something fundamental about it, but they had not formalized what is so good about it. And in some sense, the main achievement of complexity theory is to formalize the notion of good. The good means polynomial time algorithms, and here that goodness can be so that goodness can now be captured formally. So what? Huh?
Complexity should be more than philosophy. I mean,
No. But that is the but that is the main philosophical basis. Yeah, I mean, what is good? That before complexity theory, people did not know formally what good is, and you may disagree. Okay, and now we have told them formally this is when you are supposed to feel good, and. So let Z1 to ZR denote the columns of Z. Let X, Xij, 1, I, 1 to M and 1 be the set of auxiliary variables, and compute this. Let this be the determinant of, you take generic linear combinations of Z's and put them in all the columns, okay, and take the determinant of that. Now you see, what Weil says actually says, Weil's theorem can be restated now saying that the coefficients of this symbolic determinant considered as a polynomial in X generate the ring CVG. Okay, so this is what is so good about it. And furthermore, the polynomial fz of x has small poly mr time computable circuit. Okay, so you can actually compute this in polynomial time. So this actually formalizes in the language of complexity theory what is so fundamental about this first fundamental theorem, which even the mathematicians knew there is something fundamental, but there is something fundamental from the complexity theoretic perspective. Okay.
What Z is? Z is a matrix of variables.
Yeah.
It's just M times R. M times R variable.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so let's another important example, the ring of matrix invariant. So let consider R tuples of matrices, the space of R tuples of matrices with the adjoint action of G SLMC, adjoint action. Let now U equal to U1 to UR be a tuple of M by M variable matrices whose entries are coordinate functions of V. Okay. Now, this is the first fundamental theorem for ring of matrix invariant by Procesi and Razumov, which says that the ring CVG is generated by traces of the form trace UI1 UL, where the length of this L is at the most m square, and I1 to IL are anything between 1 to R. Okay. Again, it was realized that this is something fundamental. Now we'll see in the context of complexity theory what is so fundamental about it. So let y1 to yl be a set of auxiliary variables. Let fluy be trace, and then the products of this symbolic. So take generic combination, not exactly van der Monde kind of combinations of ui's, and multiply them. Multiply those products and take the trace. It follows that the coefficients of flui's for 1 to m square considered as polynomials in Y generate this ring. So each of these polynomial has a small circuit, okay, and there are only polynomially many of them. So actually this whole the whole structure of this invariant ring can again be captured by polynomially many small circuits. Okay, so that is what is so good about it, and that is why that captures the fundamentalness of this in the language of complexity theory. And furthermore, FLUs have small poly-MR time computable circuits. And such circuits for complexity theory sitting here should be, these circuits are very special, and they are also called what are called read once only oblivious algebraic branching programs. Okay. So earlier, in my earlier proof, I had restated this first fundamental theorem in the language of setting, which is the main idea, in a slightly different way, and this is a simplification of my earlier reformulation, and this simplification was pointed out later by Forbes and Spilka. So this has some, this is useful later, we'll see. But the main idea is basically that this first fundamental theorem can be restated in the formalism of complexity theory. Okay. Now this would give us the key idea for how to actually attack that problem of showing that equivalence is in det when m is constant. So this is the crux of the proof. Okay. So let V be n-dimensional representation of G equal to SLMC, m constant with coordinate functions V1 to Vn. Call a circuit Cx, x equal to x1 to xl a diagonal depth 3 circuit if it computes a polynomial of the form summation I equal to 1 to s, li to the x to some di where lix are linear functions, which means first the circuit computes these linear functions, raises them to power, and then sums them up. Okay, so these are what are called diagonal depth 3 circuits in complexity theory. And now this is the first fundamental theorem, explicit FFT. The theorem is, this is the crux of the proof, that explicit FFT holds for CVG if m is constant. That is, the generators of this, for as long as m is constant, for arbitrary representation can be captured by a small circuit. Okay. Now I should say that in invariant theory over a last century, actually explicit FFTs were actually investigated intensely. For example, when m is equal to 3 and for various kinds of representation, tables were written. But people actually gave up for even m constant because it turned out that writing down these tables is very difficult. The main idea is that, and this is the crux, is actually, though it is a polynomial time algorithm, is a quite involved algorithm. Okay, so it is to be expected because even for small v's, the tables are complicated. So it was going to be that the main thing is that in invariant theory they were trying to write down tables, and here instead of table you say just algorithm. I want polynomial time algorithm, and actually such an algorithm exists, and that is the crux of the proof. More strongly, one can compute in poly n time a diagonal depth 3 circuits CVX, where diagonal considered as a polynomial in X with coefficients in CV, such that the coefficients of CVX considered as a polynomial in X as above generate this. So basically, given V and GLM and whatever the representation matrices of those generators of the group, you can actually construct very fast in polynomial time such a circuit which captures the structure of that invariant ring. This is the crux. Yeah.
So you're saying this circuit CVX has coefficients in C of V, and
there also you instead of complex numbers, you think that these LIs are linear functions in X with coefficients in C of V. Okay. Yeah.
Does this theory follow from the fact that you know how to gerandomize diagonal depth 3 circuits?
No, not this. I didn't get this theorem is the crux of the thing, okay? I mean, how to capture this is actually the non-trivial, this is the most difficult part of the proof. After that, the rest is easy. I mean, the rest is what you're.
M is constant.
Yeah, so it's just poly n, yeah.
There shouldn't be an M because
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So it's just polynomial in n, okay?
So, did you do this explicitly for, say, n equals 4?
I never tried to write down tables. I mean, that is the difference between.
The determinant, this determinant problem.
So this, okay. So you want to know explicitly. So the constant is like, for example, the main. Yeah.
I wanted to know if, this generating function.
Yeah, can I write it down by hand or something? Yeah. So I will tell you the problem is. So the constant is, so it is, so the size of this is n to the OM4, okay? So for example, when the number of variables is 3, it is n to the hundreds. You can't write it down by hands, even for the small things. So when Hilbert gave the first algorithm, Gordon said it was mythology, and this is modern efficient mythology. So that is the difference. That is what complexity theory is all about. So it is, you can't write it down by hands, but there is a fundamental difference, okay? Okay, so how do you get this thing? Okay, so I won't have time to go into the proof of this, so let me give an idea. Okay, so the proof ingredients are, of course, you use the geometric invariant theory, the work of Cayley, Hilbert, Mumford, Popper, Dirksen, etc. Standard monomial theory in representation theory, and you put it together with algebraic complexity theory. So the main idea is the thing. Like yesterday in Laurent Manuel's talk, we saw the notion of Reynolds operator. Now this Reynolds operator is the key thing in invariant theory. So to get this, and Hilbert used actually Reynolds operator in the form of so-called Cayley's sigma process. So the whole thing is actually how to implement this Reynolds operator very efficiently. So for that, of course, you have to implement representation theory very efficiently. So this standard monomial theory gives some kind of explicit basis for these representations of general group, but again what is explicit was never tried to formalize in mathematics. So the whole thing is you actually make it really explicit when m is constant, that is in polynomial time, using algebraic complexity theory, that is the work of Strassen, Valiant, there are lots of people whose works is involved. Put it all this together and you get that thing. Okay, so basically is just combining these two things together and get that circuit. And once you get that circuit, now let me give you the high level proof of how the proof goes. So by the explicit FFT for constant time, we can compute fast, and even using a depth algorithm, a diagonal depth 3 circuit CVX, such that the coefficients of CVX considered as a polynomial in X over the ring CV generate CVG. Okay, so that is the heart of the proof. After that, this is the main idea, that the invariant theory and polynomial identity testing are connected. Okay, so what this says is that this implies given 2 points A and B and V, A and B are equivalent, that is they cannot be distinguished by invariants if and only this circuit, the polynomial computed by this circuit minus the polynomial computed by this circuit, is identically zero as a polynomial. Because when you take this, the coefficients of this circuit considered as a monomial in X are the generators of that ring. So which means that if those two circuits are not identically zero, it means some of those exponentially many generators is taking different values. So that would constitute the proof. So basically, though the number of generators is exponentially many, by putting that in the form of circuit, you actually, this is the main idea. Okay, now you have actually you have some polynomial size object, and now you want to know whether it is identically zero or not. Well, this is where complexity theory helps, because the polynomial identity testing for this diagonal depth 3 circuit is in debt. This was known well before GCT. This is the work of Arvind Joglekar and Srinivasan. And this is based on the work of lots of people before. So I think we'll get surveys of this later on. So the whole thing is that invariant theory, the bottleneck of invariant theory, what is required to make classical invariant theory of the work of Hilbert, etc., efficient, is precisely the polynomial identity testing problem of complexity theory. So in some sense, that connects the classical invariant theory and complexity theory in a deep and fundamental way. So that is actually the main So this actually, I believe, is the main contribution of the positive contribution of the GCT pro. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, see, it's probably worthwhile stressing that already after once you get identity testing for any polynomial size circuit, you already have a randomizer.
Yeah.
Like a random.
Yeah, yes.
And for some classes of circuit can be done.
Yeah. So even if without this, you already know that you can actually do it. So that's the point. Okay, so the thing is, what Hilbert and others were working on, in some sense, was this polynomial identity testing in disguise. I mean, in some sense. Okay, so that is the whole thing. Yeah.
You don't really need here a deterministic.
No, you need deterministic thing, of course. No, I mean, it is not called explicit in the language of. There is no such thing called explicit in mathematics if it is randomized. I mean, they would need actual coefficients. You can write them down, but not by hand, by this algorithm. Okay. So.
I'm not so sure. I mean, if I'm a practitioner, if I'm a practitioner and I want to do this, then randomization would be fine.
Yeah. If you're a practitioner, yes.
Just fine. Then
Yeah, but unfortunately, the size of this matrix, okay, is n to the m to the. Even if you are a practitioner, you won't. As I said, this is efficient mythology, okay.
Can you reduce?
No, because the size of the matrix is this. This comes from all that. Whatever, but the conjecture is that this is a deep conjecture later on that actually this size of the circuit should not depend on m square. So this is a conjecture that in general, right now I'm doing this because I don't know how to get rid of this, but ultimately there is an algorithm. There is an algorithm which would actually bring this from polynomial in n and m both. Okay, so that is then actually it would not be mythology anymore. Then it would be real. Okay, but I think from mythology to efficient mythology, 1 century, to real, I think 1
X, how large is X? How many variables in X?
Into the m. Yeah. So it's really whatever.
So one thing I don't understand is, do you switch to linear algebra too soon?
No. Here actually a lot of it just goes through geometric invariant theory. Linear algebra comes only at the end. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So the most of the proof actually, the proof is non-elementary. So actually you give a proof to show that it is correct. You require all this Hilbert's work and everything. Okay. So the proof is non-elementary. I mean, it's not linear algebra proof at all by any stretch of. Yeah. It is not really. But ultimately you get a thing. But to show that it is correct, you need Hilbert's work and Popper's work and Dirk's and everything. To correctness requires all that, but finally, in principle, you can implement the program. Yeah. So this is the high-level proof, and now to Noether's normalization lemma. Okay. So what is? This is harder than this equivalence problem. How much time do I have? Halfway?
40 minutes.
Huh?
40 minutes.
40 minutes. Good. Okay. So Noether's normalization lemma. So let V be an n-dimensional representation of same thing, okay? So let R be the invariant ring. Now Noether's normalization lemma says that there exists a small homogeneous S, set S of poly n cardinality such that R is integral over the subring generated by S, okay? And a random small s works. That is what Hilbert showed. So the problem NNL is construct such a small s given V and G in the standard specification. So this is actually a foundational problem of invariant theory because this is like a foundational thing, Noether's normalization lemma. Now coming to your question, okay, we say that NNL is de-randomized if such a small thing of poly n cardinality can be constructed in this time. Okay, so this is different. So when you take the variety associated to that, that is actually in exponential space, ambient space. You try to do anything there, you are actually going to run into trouble. So you have to actually get this in the coordinate ring very fast. Okay, so this is actually more ideal because that actually depends upon how you that actually is not canonical because it depends upon how you choose the generators and the embedding depends on the generators, whereas this is the completely abstract. So you actually think of this as the spec of this ring, and inside that coordinate ring itself you construct these functions and in poly-NM time. Okay, so it is independent of how actually you embed in the ring. Okay.
Can you repeat that
don't understand, I'm sorry.
Okay, so what you are saying is you take spec of CVG, okay? So, but this actually, so you're thinking of that variety, correct? But you are actually embedding it into some ambient space, okay? So you are, so you are actually embedding that into some ambient space, and in that case, it would be inside the projective space V, okay? Now, this dimension is very high, so you try to do any calculations here, you are going to run into trouble, because the dimension of that thing is going to be exponential. So the whole point is not to do calculations there, okay?
So where are you doing your calculations?
Inside this coordinate ring.
Okay.
And so I will, yeah, so you not to go there, okay? So you have to do it in abstract fashion, yeah. Okay? So now, what is the significance of de-randomizing NNL? So this is the wild problem of representation theory. Classify G orbits in V explicitly. It's called wild. So explicitly again was never given any formal notion, but it is well known that the problem of classifying G orbits, even for the matrix triples, is what is called wild, means extremely hard and not supposed to have any tractable solution. So now what we are going to do is the de-randomization of NNL gives some solution to a problem which is close to this wild problem. That is its main significance. So instead of trying to classify the G orbits, what you try to classify is, given V, let V denote the class of points equivalent to V, which means that they are not distinguished by any invariant, or alternatively the orbit closures of their orbit closures intersect, okay? So instead of orbits, you are taking the equivalence class of orbits and you put two orbits in the same equivalence class if their orbit closures intersect, okay? And this is what is called the classifier. So instead of classifying orbits, now you try to classify these orbits explicitly, okay? Again in quotes, because so this is the coarser moduli problem, but again Mumford and nobody actually thinks of this explicitly, okay? So the whole point is now we'll give an complexity theoretic meaning to this explicitly, and what de-randomization implies is an explicit solution to this problem, okay? So how I will explain that now. Now explicit from the context of complexity theory. So how is that? So suppose that NNL for R can be de-randomized. So let S1 to SL, L equal to polynomial in M and N be an explicit small poly-n time computable subset, okay, such that R is integral over the subring generated by R. That is what it means that NNL has been de-randomized. And again, we assume that each SI of S is represented by a circuit with rational constants over the coordinates V, V1 to Vn of V, okay. So you are, so all these are actually, of course, I mean, every invariant here is a polynomial function on the coordinate ring, and it is going to be represented by a circuit over the coordinates of that CVG, okay? So when you say that you can actually, huh? What?
What does it mean NNL can be de-randomized?
It means that you can construct such an S in polynomial time.
So here it's explanation of what does it mean.
Yes. Yeah, and actually I had stated that on the last slide also, that S can be computed in polynomial time, okay? Now pi of, so given such an S, let pi of S from V to CL denote the map which takes any V and just evaluate this S1 to SL at those points, okay? So just take the evaluation map. Now if S is explicit, then this map is explicit in the sense that given any rational point here, you can compute this output in polynomial time, okay? And give on any rational V. So now it can be shown using algebraic geometry that the image of pi S of V to CL is a closed subvariety of CL. I mean, in general the images can be constructible, but in this case it is closed. And then the points of the image, which we shall denote as V mod G S, okay, are in one-to-one correspondence with the equivalence classes of V. So this follows from Hilbert-Mumford theory. Now this implies the explicit classification, or rather parameterization of V's, because the map pi of S is polynomial time computable, because given any point in that equivalence class, you can actually compute what the parameter values are at that point in polynomial time. In contrast, if you take the Hilbert-Mumford map, I mean, if you fix any set of generators F1 to Fk for this ring, and then just evaluate any point, those generators of that map is not explicit. The reason is that this number of generators can be exponential. In fact, it almost always it is exponential. Okay, so this kind of gives the moduli problem of algebraic geometry from an explicit complexity theoretic point of view. Okay, so
Explicit but not implementable nonetheless. So it's
Now, instead of a system of generators, you take a system of parameters. Is that not different?
it's random linear combinations of generators.
No, instead of taking
Explicit.
Explicit random linear.
there is no such thing as explicit random. You can't fix random thing and then it is not random anymore. Okay, yeah.
Instead of taking a system of generators of the Ringleton value.
Yeah, you are taking a system of parameter.
That's
Correct.
very different.
That is very different. Yes.
This is not coming. This is
Exactly. Yeah.
So are you saying that the image of pi s, when pi s separates a class of points?
Yeah, it's a separating invariants.
Yes. But now, if you just, for instance, have the idea of substituting every element of the Noether normalization by its square, that would be another Noether normalization. And then you'd get another map pi s, but that wouldn't separate as much as the original one, because if 2 points are negative to each other, the squares would be the same. So I don't
Yeah, but you have to make sure that these S's are such, so it is not like invariant under this notion of, so they won't be separating if you take the square, for example, okay? But you have to make sure, so this theorem would make sure that actually S's are such that all points where the invariants are separate, you will get separate values. That is part of the problem. But if you just, it is not invariant under the squaring operation or something like that. That is what you're saying.
The square operation transforms one system of parameters to another system of parameters. So
Yeah, but that system, the system of parameters need not be separating. I mean, if the first system of parameters is separating and you are just taking their squares, it is system of parameters, but it need not be separating, correct?
that's right.
Exactly. So this is not just separating it's not just a system of parameters, it's more than system of parameters. Okay? So it is not just system of parameters, it's more than system of parameters. I mean, so for example, if you take squaring, the system of parameters still remains a system of parameters, but it is no longer.
So what exactly are you supposing in addition to being a system of parameters?
That they are separating invariants. Okay? Separating invariants. They are not just generating, they are separating invariants. Yeah.
Integrality is not enough.
Integrality is not enough. You need more than that. Is exactly his point, because you take the squares, it is again integral, but you need more. Okay, so now with that, the theorem, the NNL for V mod G is in quasi-det if M is constant. Okay, so again you can compute such a parameter, such a set S. So quasi-det means that it is not actually polynomial, it is 2 to the polylog n, okay, instead of, so if M is constant, it is not polynomial, it's 2 to the log square n. I think log square n, yeah.
Again, if you just consider NNL, you don't have this separation condition. So is it NNL plus separation?
Plus separation, yeah.
So I didn't catch that.
NNL, you just need to choose S such that you have this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but this is a stronger form of NNL.
Yeah, you require that S is a separating set of invariants.
Also, which is stronger. This is a stronger. So it's not an NNL; it's a strong NNL for V mod G. Okay, is in quasi-det if M is so. Sorry, yeah, that is a good point. So this actually does the stronger form of NNL. Okay. So this again follows from the proof. The main crux is of course explicit FFT for constant time, which was the earlier theorem which I had stated. Then you use geometric invariant theory, and plus the important thing is that instead of so-called white box de-randomization of polynomial identity testing for diagonal depth 3 circuits, you use so-called black box. Again, this was known before GCT5, so this was the work of Spilka and Volkovich, and also done in Agrawal Saha and Saxena later, but actually it essentially done here, Spilka and Volkovich. Okay, and then now let us come to the ring of matrix invariants. So let V MMCR be the space of M by M matrices, R tuples of M by M matrices. Now M is not constant, okay? With the adjoint action of G equal to SLMC, okay? So the whole thing is here, the conjecture is that this is true also for arbitrary M. So for example, this M can be brought down to, should not appear in the exponent. Then your concerns would be addressed, but unfortunately not today, okay? So I mean, you would be able to, in principle, you should be able to write down this matrix, in principle. That is the conjecture. But so the thing is, can you make it a polynomial when M is not constant? Okay, so this is the first thing in that direction. Not for arbitrary representations, we don't know how to do it. So for example, for the vector invariants, that is Wiles thing, you can do it. And this is the second example was matrix invariant. So here, let V be the space of matrix tuples, R by R matrix tuples with the adjoint action of G equal to SLMC. So here again, using that idea, in GCT5 it was shown that NNL for V mod G can be de-randomized if symbolic determinant identity testing has black box de-randomization. So let me just explain to mathematicians here, because this is an important concept from complexity theory which is used. So what is de-randomization of symbolic determinant identity testing? So the problem is the following. So let us say that x1 to xn are variables. Okay, x1 to xn are some variables, and I'm given some matrix of size m equal to polynomial in n, and at each place Lij, I have some linear function of x1 to xn, possibly non-homogeneous. Okay, yeah. And now you ask, so let me call this huge matrix capital X, and so determinant of X is this, what is called the symbolic determinant. This is what we called symbolic determinant yesterday. Okay. So symbolic determinant identity testing. Determinant identity testing, or referred to as SDIT, and this is an important concept in complexity theory, is given X. Okay, so the coefficients can be rational, so you are given that symbolic matrix, decide if det of X is 0, identically 0 as a polynomial. Okay. This is the problem. So you are given a symbolic matrix and you want to know whether that polynomial is identically 0. Now if you try to do it mathematically, this is actually going to take exponential time, because if you try to expand that determinant, okay, which mathematicians won't mind, but the complexity theorists would take strong objection to, because the point is the number of terms in that expansion would be exponential, and you simply can't do this.
How much does it cost to raise x to the nth power?
Huge amount of time, because you will have to write down those polynomials there, and so when you actually do the thing, they would be all polynomials in n variables of
square x times x.
That is easy, but you're
and but then it becomes no longer linear after that.
Yeah. That's the whole point.
So you do x to the 4.
Yeah. So right. So you can't do this. The mathematical algorithm won't work. Okay. So but this algorithm, which mathematicians may not accept, is you just plug in random values of x1 to xn. Okay, large enough integer matrices. If that polynomial is not identically 0, with high probability, the resulting thing would not be equal to 0. So you would know with high probability it is the case. Okay. So this is a randomized polynomial time algorithm for deterministic identity testing, and this is an important hypothesis. So this is called the de-randomization hypothesis. That, so what is the black box de-random?
Is there a reason not to call it singularity testing? It's a singularity test.
Yeah. Is there a reason for not
calling it identity testing?
This is not my terminology, so I'm just.
question. Why can't you just do symbolic Gaussian elimination?
Exponential time.
Because they're multivariate polynomials. So if you do the Gaussian elimination, you're going to get multivariate polynomials as you go along.
The first step is cheap, but then it starts getting more and more expensive with each step, same as powering.
The LIJs are linear functions.
Right, but after you do one round of Gaussian elimination, they become rational functions.
Okay, so that is the whole point. Okay, so you can't do that. So the black box de-randomization hypothesis, black box de-randomization hypothesis, and this is a fundamental hypothesis in complexity theory, says that, and now you see that this algorithm for just plugging in the random values doesn't depend upon the symbolic determinant, okay? Because it is regardless of what that symbolic matrix is, you just do it randomly. You don't even look inside it, because all you are given is that given an x, you just want a black box algorithm for evaluating that determinant, okay? So you are not even looking inside what that matrix looks like. So that is called a black box randomized algorithm. So what this says that actually there exists a deterministic black box polynomial time algorithm for symbolic determinant identity testing. Okay, so this is a fundamental hypothesis, and this is essentially equivalent to proving lower bounds for exponential time computable multilinear polynomials. So this is a hard lower bound problem, though it does not appear to be, but it is actually a lower bound problem. Okay, so this is symbolic determinant identity testing has black box de-randomization. This is what that means. Okay, so this is actually the connection between NNL for NN, and this actually is more general thing is shown that basically as long as, so the result is in GCT5 is that as NNL for arbitrary VG can be de-randomized by polynomial identity testing, assuming black box de-randomization of polynomial identity testing, as long as that the invariant ring has explicit FFT. Okay, so basically, and the conjecture is that it has an explicit FFT. So in fact, this gives a tight connection between NNL for V mod G, the stronger form of NNL for V mod G, and polynomial identity testing. So,
does it imply that you have in fact like black box identity testing for all formulas of polynomial size? Does like if you have black box polynomial time identity testing for determinant, you have also for all formulas of polynomial size, right? And when it's in fact mean that you have black box PIT for in fact that it will mean that you have black box PIT for all formulas, and it implies that VP will equal to VNP. You have
what is it? No, VP, black box de-randomization of symbolic determinant identity testing doesn't say VP is not equal to VNP. It only tells that exponential time computable multilinear polynomial. So if you have black box de-randomization hypothesis for HDIT, you are asking me what lower bound it implies, correct? It implies that there exists some exponential time computable multilinear polynomial, okay, cannot be computed by symbolic determinants of size O of 2 to the n to the epsilon for arbitrary small epsilon, forgetting about quasi-factors. And permanent is one of them, but it doesn't say anything for permanent. So it won't separate VP from VNP. That is what you are asking, right? It won't. Okay?
Excuse me, so you call it hypothesis, so it means it's a conjecture or something?
Oh, yeah. So in fact, it is the same thing as... in fact, what I said yesterday was that NNL is essentially equivalent to the stronger form of this hypothesis. That equivalence theorem actually says it's a very hard problem, okay? So that is the equivalence theorem. So
say this is converse. If permanent is exponentially hard, then this hypothesis
holds. Yeah.
Why is that? Well, it's a theorem. It's a theorem of Cabanet and Cagliari. So both directions that if permanent requires exponential size circuits, this hypothesis is true. exactly one direction and the other direction, same paper, Cabanas and Pareto. If this hypothesis is true, then you get some lower bound which is close, I think, to
No, not close.
That's something about multilinear.
But next, so basically it would say that you will get lower bounds for next.
Actually, the ground follow given from white box identity, that's not just from black box.
For black box, you actually get lower bounds for X when that is essentially tight. That is Heinz and Schnorr and that kind of thing. Okay, so that is, yeah. And from white box, you get for next. Okay. So that is a short course on complexity theory, but some of the most important part of it. Okay. So when in the Fox version of GCT5, when this thing appeared, I had conjectured that actually to make this result unconditional, what remained to be done would be difficult. And actually, I'm a complexity theorist, and I have to admit that I had not read complexity theory. At least I had not followed all parts of complexity theory. And so it turned out that actually what remained to be done had already been done. And this is the work of Forbes and Spilka, which remarkably had appeared just a month before GCT5. And this basically had already given what was needed to complete the proof. And so what the thing is, if you take the theorem 1, of this GCT5 and you take the variant of that for read once only oblivious algebraic branching programs, so that comes by just the slight modification of the proof. It's the same proof, but where I restated that Procesi-Razmousla's theorem in the language of circuits, you can just modify that slightly and you can get read once only oblivious algebraic branching programs. And that theorem, in conjunction with this result of Forbes and Spilka, implies that NNL for V mod G can be quasi-de-randomized unconditionally. Okay, so what does that say in the context of wild problems? Okay, so what this says is that the equivalence classes V of matrix tuples can be parameterized quasi-explicitly. That is what it says. Okay.
Can you just say a little bit about what this quasi-de-randomized means?
Quasi means instead of polynomial 2 to the polylog.
Yeah. The quasi-de-randomized to me means an algorithm, right? So I don't know what quasi-de-randomized
is. The polygon.
It's not polynomial time, it's a bit
Okay.
No, de-randomization is genuine. It's not that you are not de-randomizing it.
Now I understand. Sorry.
Okay.
Like show the previous slide for a moment. What was the statement of this Spilka form? Quasi, okay.
Oh, it is quasi, sorry. So that is where that quasi comes from. So in theorem 2, what they showed was that has quasi black box de-randomization.
Yes, I know.
That is from where quasi comes from. Okay. Okay. And now it says, so what does that mean? So this is the implication. I mean, this is quite astonishing actually in some sense, because...
Just to make sure I'm not totally lost. So when you say can be parameterized quasi-explicitly, you mean can be parameterized explicitly in quasi-polynomial time?
Exactly. Yes.
I'm catching up.
You have a point. The quasi is now explicit, but polynomial.
Okay, so this is the thing. I mean, I think GCT, there are two things in GCT which are very important. One is border, what lies on the border. And the other thing is explicit. Now, mathematicians know that whenever you consider a problem, like whenever you consider any such thing, okay, even if this is not part of the problem, you have to look at the border. Okay, I mean, this is something that mathematicians, just algebraic geometers, take for granted. But in complexity theory, actually, they don't want to look at the border in some sense. Okay, so to them, border is a very mystical thing, and to mathematicians, explicit is it. So explicit is to mathematicians what border is to complexity theory. Something like that. And to appreciate this GCT program, you have to know both border and believe in both border and explicitness.
So you're not considering matrices, but powers are close to matrices.
Power? Yeah. So it is Vm to the R, okay? VMC to the R. So now it is known that classifying G orbits of matrix tuples is the so-called wild problem of representation theory. So you can't do it explicitly as by mathematicians' notion of explicit, whatever that means. Okay, so it is a hard, that is why it is called a wild problem of representation theory. So what this says, actually, you cannot classify the G orbits. Okay, so you cannot attach to any G orbit some sequence. For example, if you want to parameterize the orbit by something, so say you would have classified it, so if to every orbit you could compute very fast some sequence of tuples, so that all the orbits, if given any point, you will be in a black box fashion, you would be I'm trying to explain what classification of G orbits would be to complexity theory. So what so in some sense this classification would be done this is not how mathematicians look at it, but this is how complexity theorists would look at it. Okay, so the problem would be this classifying G orbits would be given V, compute, so in polynomial time by explicit, okay, compute in the total bit length of V time, okay, some tuple, okay, some vector or whatever, some output, so Fv which consists of F1V, etc., some sequence of evaluations of this polynomial, something like that, such that if Fv is equal to Fw, if and only if the orbit of G is equal to the orbit of W. Okay, this would be this would be what classification would be. That is, you actually to each V you assign in a black box fashion some output, so that the things which are in the same orbit are assigned the same thing very fast. Okay.
But these are not polynomials. These are
not polynomial. Anything can anything. It can be anything. It need not be. So anything which depends on that polynomial, whatever the output is, doesn't have to be polynomial. But the thing is, Fv should be equal to Fw if and only if Gv equal to Gw. It doesn't have to be polynomials. Okay, some Fv output such that those two objects are the same if and only if Gv equal to Gw. But you should be able to do that in polynomial time. So then you would say that it has been classified explicitly from the complexity theory point of view. But since mathematicians don't view it from the complexity theory perspective, they have their own notion of explicit. But
nobody, I think, has ever proved that this is a hard problem.
No.
So this is an open problem.
This is an open problem.
Because as far as I understand, this definition of wildness is not.
It's
different.
It's different.
That's right. Even Mumford, his book, had like a remark where he kind of makes fun of this definition. You cannot, describe this quote.
I mean, here you can take a Turing machine, then V has rational.
No, but there is no hardness thing. I think it is worth proving. It would be good to have a hardness result. Yes. Okay. But what this does is the next best thing in some sense. Okay, because what this says that okay, you can't do that for V. I mean, you can't. Fv would not be equal to Fw if and only if Gv equal to this. So instead of that, what it does is this thing. If you forget the quasi factor, what it does, it will compute something such that you would have, let us call this new Gv, that Gv is equal to Gw if and only if the orbit closures of Gv and Gw intersect, do not intersect, or intersect. Yeah. So Gv equal to Gw is replaced by this. So if you replace that with this easier thing, then actually you solve the problem. Huh?
Closure lines.
Yeah, closures. Okay, so this. So in some sense, you can get as close to it as you can hope to, given that the problem of classifying orbits is wild. So this is probably the best one may hope in this context from the complexity perspective. The conjecture is that if explicit FFT holds for the conjecture is that all this can be done for arbitrary M. Okay, that explicit FFT holds for arbitrary V and G. That is, given any invariant ring, you can actually capture its invariant structure by a small polynomial which can be computed fast. And NNL can be de-randomized for any V mod G. And actually the theorem in GCT5 says that this is so if PIT has black box de-randomization. If explicit FFT holds for arbitrary V mod G, then NNL can actually be de-randomized for any V mod G, assuming black box de-randomization hypothesis for arbitrary polynomial identity testing. Now, let us say that all this works, and so I think this would be a deep, if this can be proved, this would have actually deep consequences in the representation theory also, and so forth. But let us say that even all this is done, we are still very far from understanding the orbit closure of the determinant. Why is that? So this is the fundamental difference between V mod G and the orbit closure of the determinant. As I said, orbit closure of the determinant has conjecturally bad exterior points where the exponential blow-up occurs. In contrast, by Hilbert-Mumford, the map pi V mod G from V to V mod G is surjective, which means there are no exterior points. It has no boundary. So in this sense, this is a kind of explicit variety where all those pathological boundary phenomenon, which is what is causing the major roadblock in the permanent versus determinant problem, is absent. Okay, so we can prove, even if we prove this result, we can make absolutely no claims about the permanent versus determinant problem on the basis of such results, because this is actually missing. And but this does provide a lot of intermediate problems. The whole point was of the GCT program was, okay, the orbit closure of the determinant is well beyond our understanding from the complexity theoretic perspective. So let us try to understand it for some easier explicit varieties first. And this V mod G actually gives lots of explicit varieties in between, because we have done this now for here, whatever the R triples of matrices and when G is constant. But there are lots of representations, that you can take as intermediate steps and hope to get some understanding. And then finally, the main thing remains now: how do you attack the orbit closure of the determinant? And that is what the GCT program is all about. So let me just say in few words. So the whole thing is, so this is a program to cross the GCT chasm via a series of intermediate upper bound problems in algebraic geometry and representation theory. As I said, the gap is so huge, X space versus det, that it is unrealistic that we are going to prove that lower bound without understanding upper bound theory first. And as I said, if we just want to prove lower bounds, then there is a phase transition. Suddenly the problem becomes very hard. For example, in the depth 3 circuit, up to 2 to the square root of n log n you can go, and then suddenly the problem becomes very hard. So there are no intermediate lower bound problems to work on if you are just confining yourself to lower bound. So the whole thing is try to understand the upper bound side first, and then use that to understand the lower bound. So here is some Kronecker problem, which turns out to be fundamental importance in the whole program. So given 3 partitions alpha, beta and lambda, decide if the Kronecker coefficient is non-zero. And this is going to be done in the next session. This Kronecker coefficient is going to be defined there. And the conjecture from GCT6 is that this is in P if alpha, beta and lambda are given in binary, and in det if they are given in unary. And furthermore, this Kronecker coefficient has a positive formula. If this can be done, then we have already made a lot of advance towards understanding what lies on the orbit.
So Kronecker eats alpha, beta, and lambda and decides 0, non-zero. What is that?
And in det, the complexity class det. So that problem is in P if alpha, beta, and lambda are given in binary, and in the complexity class det, that is, you can reduce it to the determinant computation if alpha, beta and lambda are given in unary. That is, if I give you alpha, beta, lambda in unary, I can write down the matrix of size polynomial in the thing, etc.
So what's the evidence for this conjecture?
So for example, for Littlewood-Richardson coefficients, both can be done, and even for det it can be done, and this follows from the work of Dirksen and Wyman. It can be done in randomized determinants. So I think I will talk about this on Friday. Yeah. So at least for one non-trivial thing, a non-trivial class of coefficients, you can not det but R det. You can do that in R det, but there is a big gap between Littlewood and Kronecker, and this is a huge problem. Okay, so.
But You still believe that Kronecker is in P?
Because if it is not in P, then almost certainly NNL is not in P, and then you have that collapse. I will explain that on Friday, okay? Because if this is not in P, then NNL is this is a problem associated with the orbit, and NNL is a problem associated with orbit closures. Then I would say on Friday, so there is some evidence for why this Kronecker is in P. So one can show that if there is some explicit variety, you take its quotient is again explicit, and black box de-randomization hypothesis holds for SDIT, then Kronecker is in P. Of course, we don't know if the black box de-randomization hypothesis is true and all that. So if this is not in P, then I would expect then all what I said yesterday would start going out of control. And we hope that all the conjectures are true in complexity.
You don't know that it's in P either.
You don't know that it is, right now you just know that it is in P to the sharp P. Okay, I mean you don't even have a sharp P formula, but it was by the way, it was the same problem for Littlewood-Richardson coefficient. Before the saturation theorem, it was only known to be in P to the sharp P, and now actually it is in P and date. So in 10 years the things have changed. So there was no BPP algorithm even for Littlewood-Richardson coefficient, and in the last 10 years it has come down to now this. So the same thing, but this could take more than whatever. So this is going to be in the next session on Kronecker coefficients and positivity, and after that, I think on Friday afternoon, Jerzy would talk about that Quiver theory, and he would say something which implies that this is in R-det for Littlewood-Richardson coefficients, and then I would say a few things about the GCT program, and we can have some discussion on the broader issues about the GCT program and so forth on Friday. So I think with that, let me stop here. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So what you just said something 2 minutes ago about the Kronecker coefficients and identity testing. What was that? I didn't catch it.
Kronecker coefficients and identity testing? No. It is so what Dirksen-Wyman result, which he would talk about on Friday, okay, shows is the following. Implies. They didn't worry about complexity theory issues, but it can be deduced from that this implies okay, that Littlewood-Richardson problem. Okay, so given 3 partitions alpha, beta, and lambda, decided the Littlewood-Richardson coefficient is non-zero. Okay, that problem belongs to randomized det if alpha, beta, and lambda are given in unary. This is the main significance of the result from the complexity theory perspective. Okay, and now before this result and that of Knudsen and Tau, it was not known if this problem is even in BPP or it was only known to be in P to the sharp P. Okay, so it has brought it down from P to the sharp P to det. I mean, it is incredible actually. So it's a fundamental result. So we'll talk about that on thing. So what I'm saying is that just because it is in P to the sharp P, and so I expect that this should be in P, otherwise the bad news, what I said yesterday, would happen, and none of us want that, and I also believe that that is not the case. So yeah.
So I wonder, so you have this result about the simultaneous conjugation of matrices. We know there are now efficient algorithms for testing whether the order closures intersect or not.
Yeah, there are.
They are efficient, they are not.
Oh yeah. They are actually efficient from the. Yeah. I mean, it's.
My question is, now if you think about tensors of order 3.
There might be. I think that is the next thing to worry about.
It's a very interesting question whether such a thing could happen also for such tensors.
Yes.
So if your conjecture is right.
Yeah.
Yes,
you should. Yeah.
Do you have any evidence? So for instance, if you have tensors of the dimension format n and 3. So you see, like
I never worked on that, so I think
have any idea? So
I think not now, but I will think.
Is there like one of these analogs of the first fundamental theorem? Like, I think that's the main question.
Yes. So
I mean, what I'm saying.
We have this for the conjugation. We have this.
So what I'm saying.
Yeah. Ring of invariance.
Yeah.
The question: what happens if you?
Is there FFT known?
No, that's my question. So it's
Is FFT known for 3?
No, there's no analog.
it's what Popov.
No, but the point is FFT in mathematics, when they say FFT, they want nice formula. Okay, now we are not asking for anything nice. We are just asking for polynomial time algorithms. Okay, so that may make it tractable.
But don't you use that in FFT? It tells you that the invariants have some nice forms that allows you to construct the nice.
Yeah. But for example, what I'm saying is that when m was constant, this explicit FFT thing was studied, but they always wanted some very nice things, and that is why probably you couldn't get the explicit FFT from the complexity theory perspective. Whereas here in the thing, you get an algorithm, but what you get finally is not so nice. But it runs in polynomial time, so it's okay. So it may be possible. Yeah.
As you mentioned, that for the equivalence problem, it's enough to have separating invariants.
Correct.
Not necessarily
Correct.
Now it is known that if n is the transcendence degree of the invariant ring, then you can always get along with 2n plus 1 separating invariants.
If n is the what?
The transcendence degree, that is the cruel dimension of the invariant ring. So it's a new n. This is smaller than the n you're using. That's the transcendence degree of the invariant ring. Then there's always a set of size 2n plus 1
Yes.
of separating invariants.
Yes.
Is there any use you can make of this?
Yeah, but I think, like for example, for Noether normalization lemma, you knew that there exists a system of parameters of n plus 1 size, okay? But to make that explicit is what this NNL is all about, okay? And the whole, and actually this is trying to make exactly that explicit, even in the strong sense. But to get that explicit in the complexity theory perspective, to get polynomial time algorithm, is a huge problem. Actually, I've shown for some important classes it can be done, like when m is constant and when for matrix invariants and all that. And the general conjecture would be that in general you can do it, but that would require explicit FFT for general invariant rings. And I think now there is a motivation. I think complexity theories and invariant theories can start working together. I think there are lots of things in between. Because we want to keep ourselves busy until the permanent ones is determined. And I think there is a lot of things to keep ourselves busy, because orbit closure is not happening during our lifetime. So I think.
Okay, so there's no question. Let's thank again.
Thank you.